All right.
Hello, and welcome to week 3 review for AP Environmental Science. This week, I'll be going over topics about primary productivity, trophic levels, energy flow and the 10% rule, and food chains and food webs. So let's start off by reviewing what you probably already know about energy, and that's the forms of energy that can be in an ecosystem. So the first type is, of course, kinetic energy, or the energy of motion, and oftentimes we see this in heat given off by things that are burning. So like this wood is under combustion and it's giving off heat, and then also this light bulb here is radiating light, and we can see that also by heat as well. The other type of energy is potential, and for biological systems, this tends to be in the form of chemical bonds in molecules. So I've got this picture here of a teaspoon or tablespoon of sugar, and sugar, of course, is very high in energy and caloric value, and so we can break down those sugars and get energy from the release of energy from the bonds. And then, of course, I've got the structure of ATP to the right. That is sort of the cellular currency of energy and is used to do a lot of different things on the cellular level. So other things that are important to this particular review are going to be the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law is very similar to what was discussed last week when talking about biogeochemical cycles. So just like mass or matter, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It really is only converted from different forms. So potential to kinetic, chemical to heat, chemical to light, and so forth. What's really important for the rest of this discussion is going to be how is energy being transferred from one living thing to another in a system. But right now, I've got this example of a coal-fired power plant, which you will hear a lot about later on in the course. And I want to sort of demonstrate how energy is being converted into different forms here. So first, we've got the chemical energy that is in the rocks of coal here. They are being burned in the boiler, and so it's letting off heat. That heat is then being absorbed by water in the pipes. That is going to heat up the water to be steam. That steam is going to then be transformed into the mechanical energy of this turbine spinning. And that turbine spinning is going to then spin a generator. And that's actually what creates the electrical energy that's going to be diverted out of the power lines to the users. So we've gone from chemical energy, heat, mechanical energy, and then electrical energy all in one particular process. So let's look at the second law, and this is going to be really important later when we talk about food chains and trophic levels. So the second law is that energy is always transformed into less usable forms. And I know that sounds a little odd because we're still using the energy, but really what this means is that the amount of disorder in the system is always increasing, or entropy. Entropy is sort of like disorder. So what that translates to when we look at the energy conversions in an ecosystem or even in a coal-fired power plant is that every time you convert energy to a new form, that conversion efficiency is always less than 100% and oftentimes far lower. So let's go back to the example of the coal-fired power plant. So we've got the chemical energy, thermal energy, so on and so forth. Well, in every single one of these conversions, there is a little bit of that energy that is lost as heat. So for instance, in the coal itself, not all of it is going to be completely burned. So you're going to have a lot of it that is left that has energy that did not get transferred to the steam or to the water in those pipes. In the other conversion, this thermal energy, not every single bit of the heat in this steam is going to be utilized to turn this turbine. Some of it is just going to dissipate into the atmosphere and not be used. Here in this in the turbine with the mechanical energy, not every single bit of energy here is possibly going to be transferred to the generator, and you have excess or you have energy being lost to the environment as excess heat. So throughout this entire process, you started with a certain amount of energy in the coal, and you ended with some energy to users in the form of electricity, but it was not a 100% efficient conversion. So what does this actually mean for living systems? How can we apply the laws of thermodynamics to something that's alive? So you can think of this as keeping biological order and avoiding biological disorder. So here in this, on the left-hand side, I've got a picture of this, of a cross-section of a stem, and you can see that there's a lot of order to the layout of different areas of the stem. And here on the right, I have a picture of an animal that is undergoing active decay. So the only reason why you have this really nice, beautiful, ordered structure is because that plant has been harvesting energy in order to create those structures and to keep them from decaying. This does not happen spontaneously. It takes a lot of work to put energy into maintaining order. On the other hand, decay, the falling apart of structures, that really doesn't require any energy. Energy is actually released when you're doing this, and so this happens spontaneously. And usually when something that is alive dies. So what does this mean for animals in an ecosystem, plants, fungi, bacteria? So here I've got a picture of a predator that's recently been able to catch one of its prey, and it is going to be eating the prey to get the chemical energy out of its tissues. So it's got protein, fat, and sugar in its body that now the predator can absorb and utilize. Well, once that predator then does anything else, run, reproduce, immune function, anything that takes energy, this chemical energy that had originally been gotten from the prey is going to be broken down to provide energy for these processes. And in that process, there will be heat loss every time energy is converted, as well as waste products here. And so if you remember in respiration, that's going to be carbon dioxide and water. So when we look at this as an entire system, so how is energy moving through a system through different predators, prey, consumers, we're really looking at the flow of it. So we're going to start here with the sun. This is where all energy in ecosystems originate, and we are going to follow the energy flow. So those are in those red arrows. So primary producers are going to be the ones that convert sun energy into chemical energy that can be utilized by the rest of the ecosystem. We usually, think about this as photosynthesis. But even that process is not efficient. Some of the energy is either not absorbed at all, or it's lost as heat once the primary producers start using that energy themselves. So whatever is left over in the primary producer level, that's what primary consumers can use. And it transfers up and up the chain until you get all the way to tertiary consumers. But through their own biological processes that they're doing to survive, energy is consistently being lost from the system as waste heat. Now, there's another thing that's happening within this diagram, and that's also chemical cycling. So if you remember from last week, we're basically talking about the matter, biogeochemical cycles. And notice that is not a one-way street. The energy it comes from the sun and it leaves as waste heat through every single interaction. But matter is constantly cycling. So the matter in primary producers is always going to be transferred to something else, and it just continues to cycle through. So when we want to quantify the amount of energy conversion in an ecosystem, we normally look at productivity, or the rate at which solar energy is converted into organic compounds via photosynthesis over some unit of time. And so for APES, This is going to be in kilocalories per meter squared per year. So basically, how much biomass are the primary producers making in an ecosystem? We can actually, again, quantify this by massing the dry biomass of the producers themselves. The reason we have to use dry biomass is because water has no value as energy. And so normally we have to like dehydrate a specimen in order to really know how much primary productivity has happened. So there are some more, there are different parts of productivity of an ecosystem. And what you will need to know for sure is the difference between gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. So you can, or you have probably heard people saying like gross domestic product, or using this term in reference to making something, right? So when we say gross primary productivity, what we are talking about is the total rate of photosynthesis in a given area. All of it, everything that is being produced. But in order for us to know how much of that productivity is available to the rest of the ecosystem, we have to take away the plant's own metabolic demand through respiration. So this is the rate of energy used by photosynthesizers for their own metabolic needs. After you do that, now we know how much biomass or how much productivity is left over for everything else, which are the consumers. So net primary productivity is an important thing to understand if you want to know how much food is left for the rest of the ecosystem. All right, so speaking of ecosystems, let's kind of take a look at all of the different biomes and ecosystems that you've been learning about in terms of their productivity. So first, let's kind of look at their surface area and what percentage they make up totally out of all of surface area on Earth. Because remember, we want to look at this in meters squared. So of course, the open ocean is going to have the greatest percentage of Earth's surface area, followed by all of these terrestrial areas. But when we look at the actual primary productivity of each one of these ecosystems, it's very different, and there's some good reasons why. So of all of the aquatic systems, algal beds and reefs are the most productive. The tropical rainforest is the most productive sort of forest ecosystem. And then here for freshwater ecosystems, you've got swamps and marshes. But we also have to account the actual surface area of these ecosystems as well. And so when we look at that, there are some changes here. So for instance, the ocean is actually about 25% of Earth's net primary productivity, but that's because it's just so big. Tropical rainforest is another about 22% of that, and then you've got other biomes sort of contributing in different ways. So what factors are affecting this productivity? Why are some ecosystems more productive than others? Well, let's talk a little bit about aquatic systems first. So in order for aquatic photosynthesizers to do photosynthesis, they have to have access to light. And if you look at this diagram, you know, most of the red light and the purple light only can penetrate up to about 50 meters down. So really, photosynthesis, the bulk of it in an aquatic system, takes place right here at the first meter. Now, on a really clear day where the water is very clear, you may have some photosynthesis happen here, but those organisms that do live at that level of the aquatic system have evolved to use this particular type of light for photosynthesis. So let's talk a little bit about the nutrient requirements here. So this is another example of an aquatic system, and you've got various different points that have been sampled. And here in graph B, This is showing how the abundance of phytoplankton is highly correlated to the amount of inorganic phosphorus that is in the system at any given time. And if you remember from those biogeochemical cycles, we know that phosphorus is one of the biggest limiting factors on primary productivity or the growth of producers. And C here, we're looking at another limiting factor from a biogeochemical cycle, ammonium. And if you remember, ammonium is part of the nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen is just as important for producer growth as phosphorus. So the more ammonium you have in the water, the greater the phytoplankton growth was. So how does this affect the rest of the ecosystem? So we know that producers need sunlight, they need nutrients, they need good temperatures, but how does that affect everything else up from the producer level? So I've got an example of a terrestrial food chain as well as an aquatic food chain here. We've got plants at the producer level and phytoplankton for the aquatic food chain. So things that are going to get their energy directly from these producers, we call them primary consumers. And in the terrestrial food chain, that could be a grasshopper here, or an insect, or an herbivore. In the aquatic food chain, often it's zooplankton, or these tiny animals that are very small that feed on phytoplankton. The organisms that consume primary consumers or get their energy from primary consumers are secondary consumers. So here, this small mammal, a mouse, is going to be eating the grasshopper and getting energy from it. On the aquatic side, you've got small fish, herring, that are going to be eating the zooplankton. Tertiary consumers are those organisms that get their energy from secondary consumers. So on the terrestrial side, you might have a snake that eats this mouse. It could be an owl. On the aquatic side, you've got larger fish or maybe some other aquatic large organism that eats these small fish. And at the very top, and oftentimes in some food chain, they're not even present, but you can have a quaternary level of consumer. So these would also be known as top consumers or top carnivores. So here on the terrestrial side, I've got a hawk, and then on the aquatic side, we've got a really, really large animal, the killer whale. So let's take this back to our discussion of energy and how through every conversion, there's going to be a loss. So looking at the primary producer level, say they were able to convert 10,000 joules of energy from the sun, but they had access to about 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. So what is the efficiency of that conversion from light energy, sunlight, to chemical energy or organic compounds made in photosynthesis? Well, it's about 1%, right? Well, then if you have primary consumers that are eating primary producers, they may have about a 1,000 joule capture of those 10,000 joules that were originally in the primary producers. So now we've decreased the usable energy down to 10%. Well, maybe those secondary consumers are only able to capture about 100 joules. And so we're kind of decreasing and decreasing all the way up to tertiary consumers only having 10. And then if we were to add on another level of consumers, they would only have 1. This effect of the second law of thermodynamics also explains why there are more producers in an ecosystem than primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. This snake has to eat a lot of mice in order to get the same amount of energy as that mice got from the grasshoppers or that grasshopper got from the plants here. So let's take a look at a more complicated example of feeding relationships within a within an ecosystem. So here I've got another aquatic example, an Arctic lake food web, and we've got some organisms here that are obviously going to be producers. They're phytoplankton. Here are some aquatic plants and algae that are going to be able to photosynthesize. But then you've also got some dead decaying matter, you've got smaller organisms, and then finally the lake trout, which would be our top consumer or top carnivore. So a food web is a little different from a food chain in that it shows you more examples of how these things interact within their ecosystem. So for instance, one chain here would be aquatic plants and algae, to snails, to lake trout. But this doesn't show you that lake trout can also eat aquatic insects. They can also eat grayling, and they can also eat sculpin. So food webs are a better representation of everything that can happen within an ecosystem. So what I want to talk about next is how food webs regulate the populations within an ecosystem. So one type of regulation can happen from the producer level, and we call this bottom-up regulation, basically meaning that the population numbers of these primary consumers, secondary consumers, are dependent on the production of food by producers. So if there's a lot of phytoplankton being made at any given time, well, then there's going to be a lot of zooplankton, a lot of grayling, a lot of lake trout. But there are also some effects of the top consumers on the populations of others in their ecosystem. We call this top-down regulation or trophic cascades. So say these lake trout all of a sudden were taken out of this ecosystem. Well, what they had been doing is eating some aquatic insects here. They'd been eating these small fish, some of these small fish. But if they're not there in the ecosystem anymore, well, then they aren't preying on these and their populations are going to increase. Well, if their populations increase, well, they're going to be eating more zooplankton, and that's going to decrease the population at that level. So you can have population change both from just the amount of primary productivity that's occurring at any given time, but also what's happening at the top levels of your food web. Okay, so let's get into some questions to kind of practice what we were talking about today. So question 1 is talking about primary productivity. So the net annual primary productivity of a particular wetland ecosystem is found to be 8,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year. If respiration by the aquatic producers is 12,000 kilocalories per meter square per year, what is the gross annual primary productivity for this ecosystem in kilocalories per meter square per year? So let's think back to that formula that I showed you earlier. So we know that gross primary productivity minus respiration equals net primary productivity. So we've already been told the net primary productivity, and we've been told the respiration. So this means that gross primary productivity is equal to the net plus respiration. So net is 8,000 and respiration is 12,000. Well, that gives us 20,000 kilocalories per year. That's how much is being created by this wetland. So question 2, which of the following would be considered a primary consumer in this food web? So let's take a look at all of the individuals that are shown here. We've got phytoplankton here that are being eaten by zooplankton and then Arctic cod. Ring seal can also eat the krill, and polar bears feed on cod and seals, and orcas can feed on all of these individuals. So again, this would be our top consumer. So if we're looking for the producer level, we're going to start here at phytoplankton. but we need to know the primary consumer. And remember, primary consumers are those that feed directly on phytoplankton. So in this case, that is going to be the krill here. You can see that this arrow indicates the energy is flowing from diatoms to krill. Let's look at question 3. So 5 different concepts that we've talked about so far. An energy transformation occurs and results in increased disorder. So we talked about increased disorder being shown through heat loss as energy is being converted from different forms. That sounds like the second law of thermodynamics. Disorder is always increasing, entropy is always increasing. Accounts for the losses of usable energy between successive trophic levels in an ecosystem. This is another way to state how the second law of thermodynamics predicts energy flow in an ecosystem. Energy stored by producers in an ecosystem in organic molecules. So organic molecules, those are going to have chemical bonds. Those can then be used in respiration later on to release energy. So it is a stored form of energy. That's got to be potential. So explains why energy from the sun can be converted into chemical energy by plants. So that's thermodynamics, but we're talking about the fact that plants have this ability to use light energy to make chemical energy. Well, that is the first law of thermodynamics. Okay, question 4. Wetlands are highly productive ecosystems with complex food webs. Which of the following food webs shows the direction of energy flow that would be found in a wetland? So we're given 4 organisms here: algae, fish, eagles, and snails. So let's look at choice A first. Is it true that fish could potentially get energy from algae? I think that's probably true. Is it true that snails could probably also eat algae? Well, that's probably true. But will eagles themselves be eating the algae that's in this little stream or lake? Probably not. Eagles are top consumers. They would not be directly getting their energy from algae. So let's look at choice B. Again, algae to fish, that makes sense. Could fish potentially be eaten by snails? That's possible if they were decaying and the snails were eating them as detritivores. Okay. Could algae eat snails? That's true. Could an eagle eat a snail? I don't know, maybe. But let's look here. Eagle to fish. Are fish going to be directly preying on eagles? Not likely. All right, so let's look at C. We already know algae to fish, that's possible. Could fish eat snails? Absolutely. Could algae eat snails? That's true. Now, could an eagle get energy from a fish? Yes. But we still have one example to go, so let's double check. All right, algae to snail, sure. Snail to fish, possibly. Eagle to snail, okay, maybe. But eagle to algae, that's definitely not going to happen. So the most likely food web here that shows an appropriate direction of energy flow is C. Question 5. The graph above shows the effect of precipitation on dry matter production or biomass production of a temperate forest. Which factor is least likely to influence the amount of dry matter production in this biome? So let's take a look at the graph here. As the annual precipitation increases, there seems to be a general increase of dry matter production. More water, more photosynthesis, more productivity. That makes sense. So now we have to look at the options to figure out, other factors that could influence it, and we're looking for the least likely factor. So let's look at A, population size of tertiary consumers. Maybe that was something we kind of talked about with trophic cascades, but we're really looking at dry matter production. So average temperature of the biome, that's possible. We know that biomes that are around the equator tend to be more productive. They have higher temperatures, relative to others. Availability of soil nutrients, that's absolutely true, because we know in the example of the aquatic systems that increases in phosphorus and nitrogen increase productivity. And we know, of course, hours of sun exposure, that's going to be directly linked to photosynthesis. So really the least likely thing to influence it is probably going to be the size of tertiary consumers. Question 6. Based on the relationship shown in the food web, if the number of snakes were to suddenly decrease, which of the following changes would most likely occur in the food web of this ecosystem? So let's take a look at that food web first. We've got two producers, wildflowers and grass, two types of primary consumers, the rabbit and the mouse. We've got a secondary consumer, the snake, and then we've got our tertiary consumer, the hawk. So if you were to take out snakes from the population, so we're decreasing the snakes, what's going to happen throughout the rest of the food chain? Well, if there's less snakes, that means probably that the mice aren't being preyed upon as often, and they, as a result, will have a higher population. So those might increase as a result. So now if the mice increase in their population, they're probably going to eat more. So it might decrease some of the grass, or it might decrease some of the wildflowers, because those are two of the producers that the mice like to eat. Now the snake also preys on the rabbit, as well as the hawk preys on the rabbit. So if snakes are gone, it's also possible that rabbits may escape predation more often, and their population might increase. If their population is increasing, that's probably going to put additional pressure on the wildflowers, so their populations may decrease. So now let's look at our choices and see which one goes with what we've predicted in the food web. Increase in the number of mice. Okay. Increase in the number of wildflowers. Well, we predict that they would actually decrease. Increase in the number of hawks. I don't know. Some of their food is declining in population. I don't know if they would increase, but we'll keep it in mind. Decrease in the number of mice? Definitely not. We've already predicted that they should go up. Increase in the number of mice? Yes. Decrease in the number of grasses? That's also in our prediction. So that sounds like it might be right, but let's check and make sure. Increase in the number of hawks? Probably not. Increase in the number of grasses? Definitely. So the best choice here to go with all of our different predictions of these trophic cascades would be C. All right, let's take a look at this free response question. Between 1950 and 2000, global meat production increased from 52 billion kilograms to 240 billion kilograms. During this period, the global human population increased from 2.6 billion to 6 billion. So the first thing that they want you to do is calculate the per capita meat production in 1950 and in 2000. Use the values from part A to calculate the change in global per capita meat production during this 50-year period as a percentage of the 1950 value, and then discuss why it is more efficient to produce grain for human consumption than to produce meat for human consumption. In your answer, they want you to consider both land use and energy use. So before we start with the calculations, let's kind of review what this discuss task verb really means. So when College Board asks you to discuss something, what they're wanting you to do is go in depth about some relationship between the different concepts that they're asking you about. So in this question in particular, we have to consider the efficiency of grain production for human consumption versus meat, and then also to think about it in terms of land use and energy use. So this is going to be a much more lengthy discussion than just something that you would have to do for identifying or describing. All right, let's start with part A. So we need to calculate the per capita meat production in 1950 and in 2000. So this word is something that you will see later on in the course when you talk about human population, but what it really just means is per person. So how much meat per person was being produced in 1950 and in 2000? So they are going to give us 1 point for each year, and we have to include both our proper setup and the correct answer. So let's start with the values for 1950. So we know that in 1950 we had 52 billion kilograms, and then there were only 2.6 billion people. So those are extremely large numbers, and we know that in APES we want to use scientific notation to help us manage these really large numbers. So we're going to start with 5.2 times 10 to the 10 kilograms of meat. And we want to know per person how much meat is available. So we know that there was 2.6 times 10 to the 9, because there's 2.6 billion people in 1950. And all we have to do here is just divide. So you can always use your calculator, but this is actually a pretty easy thing to do in your head. So how many times does 2.6 go into 5.2? Well, that is 2. And then we know from the week we talked about scientific notation and subtraction and multiplication that when you divide exponents, it's just going to be basically subtraction. So, 9 from 10, that leaves 1 0. So that's really 20 kilograms of meat per person. So let's look at the values for the year 2000. So we had 240 billion kilograms versus just 6 billion people. So again, we want to start out with our amount of meat production. It's going to be 2.4 times 10 to the 11 kilograms. And then again, we've got 6.0 times 10 to the 9 people. So kind of a little bit more difficult, but if you think about just 240 billion, 240, how many times does 60 go into that? So you could move that decimal over and make that 60. That would be 4 times. And so by doing that, you end up with 1 0 left over. So we have 40 kilograms of meat per person. So an increase of 20 per person over the 50 years. All right, so we have to use that information. So let's not forget that it was 20 in 1950 and 40 in the year 2000. So using the values, they want us to calculate the change in global per capita meat production in this period, this 50-year period, as a percentage. Well, this is just percent change, and this is something that you definitely will just have to know how to do in APES, because we don't get a formula sheet, right? So they're going to give us 1 point for a proper setup and then 1 point for the correct answer. So remember that percent change is just the final value minus the initial over the initial. Okay, so we know that in
in 1950, we had an initial amount of 20 kilograms of meat per person, and then in 2000, that was 40. So at the end of that time period, we had 40 kilograms per person. We got to subtract that from our initial. And then we're going to put that over the initial, which was also 20 kilograms. All right, so 40 minus 20 divided by 20. That is going to be 20 divided by 20, which is 1. So now, in order to get it as a percentage, there's something that we need to do. We need to multiply by 100. So if we multiply by 100 here, that is going to give us a 100% increase. So that's our answer. And if you notice in the note here, the answer must be given as a percentage. So if you had gone through the trouble of setting up all this calculation, but then had forgotten to multiply by 100 to turn it into a percentage, they would not have given you the point. All right, so let's look at the discussion part. So discuss why it's more efficient to produce grain for human consumption than to produce meat for human consumption. And then we got to consider land and energy use. But before we do that, let's kind of look at this problem from a food chain perspective. So we're both in both cases, we're starting with grain production. And in one case, this grain is going to go directly to humans. And in the other example, it's going to go to some other animal. So chicken, cow, fish, turkey, however you want to say it. We'll use a cow for this example. And then that meat is going to be used for human consumption. So if you remember from our discussion on food chains, every time you are converting energy from one trophic level to another, you are going to have an inefficient conversion, and you're going to lose heat, and that's basically because of the second law of thermodynamics. So here we've got one step, one conversion, grain to humans. And the second one, we now have this intermediate step. So which one is going to be less efficient? Well, this longer food chain is a little less efficient for human consumption. So let's see what they would have given us points for. Land use. That would have been 1 point. So when raising grain for human consumption, only land for grain growth is needed. You don't have to use any additional land to grow grain to feed the animals. You also don't have to take up land space for the actual raising of the animals themselves. So land for housing, storage, putting their food, and then also containing their waste. So you could have also continued your discussion by pointing out that 1 unit of land that we use for grain will feed more people than that same unit of land used for livestock. And that's essentially because we are reducing the efficiency of the trophic levels when we add links in the chain. So speaking of energy, we also had to compare energy use between grain production and meat production. So that would have been 1 point as well. So eating lower on the food chain is more efficient because energy lost from transfer between trophic levels is reduced here because we're not, there's not as many links in the chain. So a given amount of solar energy will sustain more people when it's consumed as grain than when the grain is fed to livestock to be consumed. So you also could add on to this discussion with some information that you'll end up learning about later in the course as well. So the amount of fertilizers, water from irrigation, things like pesticides, and fossil fuel use from powering farm machinery is also going to represent an additional energy investment in meat production than in grain production. Like we said before, these animals are going to be eating and therefore making waste. And so energy is also having to be used for treating, transporting, and disposing these wastes. And then you've got just the simple fact that you have to take care of the animal. That takes machine power, that takes human power. So you're also using more energy to do that than you would to just harvest the grain and then feed it to humans. So the last thing that I want to point out about this particular answer is the depth of the response and the different parts of the discussion that are required. If you get a discuss question, so that task verb discuss, you will also need to be able to go into this kind of depth. So not just, talking about things in an ambiguous way, but really using what you know from the course to show the reader that you really understand the concepts. All right, that is the end of week 3 review. See you next time.